Settle into whatever position you are going to sleep in. There is nothing to do here but listen. Let your eyes close. Take one slow breath in through your nose. And let it go without hurrying it. Again, breathing in. And out. Now let the breath go back to its own rhythm. Bring your attention to the top of your head. Let the scalp soften. Let your forehead smooth out. Unclench your jaw and let the teeth come apart a little. Let your tongue rest. Let your eyes be heavy in their sockets. Feel your neck give up its weight to the pillow. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let that softening move down your arms. Through the elbows into the forearms. Into your hands, let the fingers uncurl. Notice your chest rising and falling on its own. Let your belly be soft. Let your back sink into whatever is holding it. Let your hips let go. Down through the thighs, heavy and warm. Behind the knees, softening. Into the calves. Into the ankles and the feet. Let the whole body be heavy now. Nothing needs your attention. Nothing needs deciding. You do not have to stay awake for any of what follows. Let the words go by. If you drift off, that is the point. The year the wood remembers. At low tide, the beach at Holme-next-the-Sea, on the north coast of Norfolk in eastern England, runs out for the better part of a mile, and a good deal of what it uncovers is not really beach at all. Under the sand lies peat, a dark, fibrous, faintly greasy layer that gives under a boot and holds the shapes of roots that stopped growing 4,000 years ago. A little more of it goes every winter. On any given tide, the peat shelf gives up hazel nuts, alder cones, the flattened stems of reeds, and once in a very long while, something that was put there on purpose. In the early spring of 1998, a man named John Lorimer was out on that shelf with his brother-in-law, catching shrimps in the shallow water at the edge of the peat, when he saw something green in the mud. It was the head of a bronze axe, and he carried it to the Castle Museum in Norwich, where it was identified as Bronze Age, which is to say something like 4,000 years old. But he kept going back. On later visits, he noticed something stranger than the axe. A tree stump was standing in the sand, and it was upside down. Its roots reached into the air. Around it, tide by tide, the sand withdrew from a ring of low wooden posts. Edwin Rose, an archaeologist working for Norfolk's County Council, came out to look at it on the 12th of August that year. His first thought was that the posts were the remains of an Anglo-Saxon fish trap, 3,000 years younger, which is the sensible guess on a coast where fish traps are common and prehistoric timber is not. It was the wrong guess. Those posts, as tree ring dating would eventually show, had been cut from living oaks between April and June of the year 2049 BC. What the sea had opened was a ring of 55 split oak posts, standing in a rough oval about 7 meters across in one direction and 6 in the other. Call it the size of a small room, set into a circular trench dug a meter deep into what had then been the ground surface. Each trunk had been halved down its length. The flat, freshly split faces were turned inward, toward the center, and the rounded, bark-covered backs were turned outward, toward the world. They were fitted so closely against one another that the ring read from outside as a single continuous wall of bark, with no gaps to look through. Exactly one of the 55 had been set the other way round, split face out. There was one way in. A trunk with a natural Y-shaped fork. In it had been set into the ring so that the fork made a narrow slot about 20 centimeters wide, just enough for a person to turn sideways and pass through. And then, directly outside that slot, a further post had been driven into the ground, standing free of the wall, positioned so that anyone on the outside looking at the entrance would see wood and not interior. At the center stood the tree. It was a mature oak, and it had been stripped of its bark and of its side roots and turned completely over, so that the mass of roots pointed at the sky and the trunk went down into the ground. It weighed well over a ton. Holes had been cut into it near the base, and threaded through those holes, still in place when archaeologists reached the stump 4,000 years later, were strands of rope twisted from honeysuckle. Honeysuckle stems are tough, flexible, and long, and a bundle of them twisted together will pull a great deal of weight. Someone had made rope, laced it through the wood, and dragged that tree across a salt marsh to the spot that would become the middle of the circle. 100 meters away, under the same sand, lay a second enclosure that nobody would know was there until the first one was already being dug. The newspapers called it sea henge. A henge is a specific thing, an earthwork with a ditch and a bank, and this was not one, but the name has stuck for a quarter of a century. The date of those posts comes from two physical processes worked together, because neither of them could do the job alone. Kathy Groves, at the Tree Ring Dating Laboratory in Sheffield, in the north of England, measured the ring widths of the timbers from the circle, and what she was measuring works like this. An oak growing in a temperate climate lays down 1 ring of wood a year, in a seasonal rhythm that is visible to the naked eye on a cut stump. In spring, when water is plentiful and the tree is racing to build the plumbing it needs for the year, it produces early wood. Wide cells with big open vessels, pale in color, soft in texture. As summer goes on and growth slows, it produces late wood. Narrower cells with thick walls, darker, denser. Then the tree stops for the winter, and the boundary between that dense summer wood and the following spring's open, pale vessels makes the line that a person counts when counting rings. A ring's width is set by the weather of that particular year. Narrow after a cold, wet summer and wide after a warm one with steady rainfall. Every oak growing in the same region in the same decades, therefore records roughly the same sequence of good and bad years. In the same order, like a barcode written slowly from the inside out. Take a piece of oak of unknown age, measure its ring widths, and slide that pattern along a much longer master sequence built from timbers of known date until the pattern locks in. Where it locks in, it tells you the calendar year of every ring in the piece, absolutely, without any statistics about decay rates or any calibration curve. Master sequences for oak in Britain and Ireland were built up over decades out of living trees, then timbers from standing medieval buildings, then archaeological timbers, then ancient waterlogged oaks pulled from bogs and river gravels, each generation of wood overlapping the last and pushing the chain further back. Peat in the fens, the flat wetland country south of Holme, is one of the richest sources of that bog oak in England. Those timbers gave up a workable sequence of well over a century and a half of growth. But the cross-match was not clean. When a short sequence is slid along the master curve, more than one position can score respectably, and at home more than one did. Ring patterns alone left a choice to be made. So a second method was brought in to choose. Jerry McCormack and Mike Bailey, at the Radiocarbon Laboratory in Belfast, in Northern Ireland, took samples from the central tree, cut as a series of blocks each spanning 20 years of growth, running in order out from the middle. Radiocarbon dating measures how much of a mildly radioactive form of carbon is left in something that was once alive. And since that carbon decays at a known rate, the proportion remaining gives an age. On its own, it gives a range rather than a year, because the amount of radiocarbon in the atmosphere has wobbled up and down through history, and a single measurement can therefore match several points on the calibration curve. but a series of samples whose separation in years is already known exactly, because you counted the rings between them, is a much stronger object than a single sample. Wobbles in the curve have to line up with wobbles in the measurements at fixed intervals, and very few places along the curve will take a whole sequence. Dendrochronologists call this wiggle matching. It turns a fuzzy range into something very close to a point. Alex Bayliss, then working for English Heritage, the public body that looks after the country's historic sites, built the statistical model that combined the two lines of evidence, treating the ring counts as fixed spacings and the radiocarbon results as constraints on where the whole assembly could sit. 6 samples went into it, 4 from the ring of posts and 2 from the central tree, and together they made a chronology 168 years long. The answer was published in the journal Nature in December 1999, in a paper of barely a page, under the title Precise Dating of the Norfolk Timber Circle. The posts of the ring were felled between April and June of 2049 BC. The tree at the center died, or was felled, between April and June of 2050 BC, a full year earlier. A smaller detail gave up the season. Bark is the last thing a tree makes, and the ring immediately under the bark is the one it was working on when it died. If a tree is cut in winter, when it has stopped growing, the outermost ring is finished. A full band of early wood followed by a full band of late wood, closed off by a clean boundary. If it is cut in the middle of the growing season, the outermost ring is caught unfinished, with early wood laid down and late wood only partly formed or not formed at all, and no closing boundary. Timbers from the circle had their bark still on, and the wood beneath it had stopped in the middle of the year's work. They had been cut down in the spring or the early summer. The same analysis puts the death of the tree at the center a year before that. Whether it was felled or blown down, and what became of it in the interval, the wood does not say. Wood from the circle held more than a date. Macy Taylor, the specialist who examined the timbers, worked on the cut surfaces. A cut surface made with a bronze axe records the blade that made it. A bronze axe is soft compared with steel, and its edge picks up damage quickly. A nick from a stone, a chip from a knot, a curve worn slightly asymmetric by resharpening. When such a blade is driven into green oak, it leaves a facet whose profile is the profile of that particular edge. And if the blade twists slightly as it is pulled free, it scribes an arc into the wood, a jam curve, that records the exact sweep of the cutting edge. Damage on the blade shows up as a repeated line inside every cut that blade makes. By matching those signatures across the timbers, it was possible to count the tools. English Heritage had the surfaces recorded in 3 dimensions with laser scanning, which allowed the curvature and width of each blade to be measured rather than eyeballed. The British Museum, describing Taylor's analysis, puts the number at 51 distinct blades, and other published counts run a little higher. Either way, the answer is dozens of separate tools swung at this timber, which means dozens of separate people, or at least dozens of separate households, contributing the most valuable metal object they owned to the same week's work. Bronze in Britain in 2049 BC was valuable. Copper and tin had to be got from a distance, alloyed, cast, ground to an edge, and maintained. An axe was a serious possession. The wood itself came from a long way further than the beach. Posts were cut from at most 25 oaks, most of them between 100 and 150 years old, and the ring patterns show them coming from a single stand of woodland. Oak does not grow on a salt marsh, so the timber was brought in from a wood that was known and drawn on deliberately rather than cleared at random. Most trunks were split into more than one post, which is why 55 posts can come out of 25 trees. Splitting green oak with wedges, outward from the center like slices of a pie and following the grain, produces a flat face far faster and with far less metal than any amount of chopping. And it produces a face that follows the natural planes of the wood and so resists rot better than a sawn one would. That central tree was much older than the posts around it, perhaps 250 to 350 years old when it came down. Digging the trench for all of this meant working in ground where the water table sat at or near the surface, and holding 55 timbers upright while it was backfilled. The tree must have gone in first and the wall been built around it, since a root mass 2.5 meters across was never going through a gap of 20 centimeters. In 2049 BC, the site lay at the landward edge of a tidal salt marsh. A flat plain of creeks and salt-tolerant plants, samphire and sea lavender, flooding on the highest tides, backed by drier ground with oak woodland on it. Not long afterward, in geological terms, a barrier of sand and dune built up offshore, and the marsh behind it stopped receiving salt water. Freshwater conditions took over. Alder colonized the wet ground, and peat began to form, and it formed over and around the circle, sealing the wood in a waterlogged, oxygen-free medium where the bacteria and fungi that normally destroy timber cannot work. Later still, the sea came back, laid sand over the peat, and hid the whole thing. It stayed hidden for something close to 4,000 years. Then, in the 20th century, the coast at home began to retreat again, the sand thinned, and the peat with the circle in it came back into the daylight and into reach of the waves. Exposed on an open beach, wetted twice a day with salt water, dried in between, ground by sand, colonized by marine borers, the same timbers had a very short future. English Heritage's position was that the monument was already being destroyed, and that removal was the only way to keep any of it. The counterposition, argued locally and argued loudly by neo-pagan and druid groups who arrived after the story reached the national papers in January 1999, was that a monument means its place, that a circle of posts in a museum case is a different object from a circle of posts on a shore, and that the sea reclaiming it was a fitting end rather than a loss. One of the campaigners, Buster Nolan, said that Seahenge has more meaning and power on the beach at home than it does anywhere else. Nobody on that side of the argument disputed that the sea would take it. Their case was that being taken by the sea in place was the right end for it. The excavation went ahead. Mark Brennand of the Norfolk Archaeological Unit directed it. Preliminary work had begun the previous autumn, and the full dig started on the 26th of May, 1999. English Heritage obtained a High Court injunction against 4 named protesters, and 2 of them later had the ban lifted after the court accepted they had not actually obstructed anyone. Work could only happen between tides, which in practice meant somewhere between 1 and 4 hours a day, with the trench bailed out each time before anything could be recorded. It cost £500,000. A crew from the television archaeology series Time Team made a documentary about it. In 2022, 15 of those timbers stood upright for 5 months in a gallery of the British Museum, in an exhibition on the world of Stonehenge, 4,070 years after they were cut. Getting them into a condition where that was possible took 9 years of chemistry. From the beach, they went 50 miles inland to the Bronze Age Center at Flag Fen, near Peterborough, and straight into fresh water, to wash out the salt and the mud and to stop the wood from drying. Because waterlogged archaeological wood that dries in air does not simply shrink. Its cell walls have been chemically eaten away over the centuries, and what holds the shape is water. Take the water out, and the timber collapses into something like charcoal-colored crumb. Getting around that means replacing the water with a solid, molecule by molecule, before taking the water out. The timbers were soaked for years in solutions of polyethylene glycol, a waxy polymer that diffuses slowly into the wood and stays there when the water is finally taken out. They later moved to Portsmouth. The conservators there look after the Mary Rose, a 16th-century warship raised from the seabed, and have more experience with this problem than almost anyone alive. Freeze-drying took out the last of the water, turning the remaining ice straight to vapor so that liquid water never pulls on a cell wall as it evaporates. Half of the circle went on display in April 2008 at the museum in King's Lynn, the nearest town of any size to the beach, arranged as a partial ring with a full-size replica showing what the whole would have looked like. That central stump, larger and slower to treat, joined it 2 years later. The second circle, home 2, was found during the survey work around the first, about 100 meters away. It is larger, a little over 13 meters across, and differently made. At the center, lying flat rather than standing, were 2 oak logs. Around them ran an oval of posts with branches woven between them, then an arc of split oak on the eastern side, then an outer palisade, a fence of split timbers set edge to edge. The logs were cut with rebates, notches shaped to receive something, and the shape of the notches implies an object a little over 2 meters long resting across them. Oak stakes were set to hold the arrangement in position. What lay on the logs is not recoverable. The published account lists the possibilities as a tree trunk, a plank stretcher, a boat or a trough, a coffin or a bier, which is a frame for carrying a body. Holme, too, was not excavated. The beach at Holme is a nature reserve holding internationally important populations of migratory birds, and the disturbance of a second full rescue dig was judged not worth it. Instead, the site was monitored, and in the early 2010s, a small number of timbers were sampled for dating. Ian Tyers carried out that analysis, published by English Heritage in 2014. 2 of the samples had bark still on them, one from the central setting, one from the outer palisade. Both gave a felling date in the spring or summer of 2049 BC, the same year as the ring of posts 100 meters away, and probably the same season. The 2 enclosures are different from each other in almost every particular. No other pair of prehistoric structures in Britain has been shown to have been built at the same time. The reading that has held the field longest takes the inversion seriously. A tree turned upside down is a considerable amount of work to achieve and impossible to do by accident. And in a great many societies, the reversal of an ordinary thing marks the passage between the living world and the world of the dead. On that reading, the tangle of roots is a platform, and the enclosure is a mortuary enclosure, a place where a body was laid out in the open air for excarnation, exposed until the flesh was gone and the bones could be gathered for burial elsewhere. Excarnation is well attested in Britain in the periods on either side of this one, in the sense that a great many prehistoric burials consist of loose bones, out of order, that were plainly somewhere else first. Exposure of the dead in the open air is documented in a number of times and places, and is still practiced in Tibet. That reading would also give the screening post at the entrance a straightforward purpose. No human remains were found in the circle, though 4,000 years of Saltmarsh, freshwater peat, and tidal sand is not a setting in which the absence of bone proves much. If the inverted roots at Holme one held a body, the horizontal logs at Holme too, with their rebates and the 2-meter object they were cut to carry, look very much like where a body might end up. Nothing recovered from either site demonstrates the connection. In 2024, a different reading appeared, from David Nance of the Geography Department at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, published in a journal called GeoJournal. The centuries around 2049 BC fall within what climate scientists call the 4.2 kiloyear event, a drying and cooling that set in around 4,200 years ago. It shows up in lake sediments, cave deposits, and ice cores across much of the northern hemisphere, and it coincides with visible disruption in several early states. Irish bog oak, which supplies one of the longest and best replicated tree ring records in Europe, shows depressed growth through the centuries from about 2,200 to 2000 BC. Nance points out that the Holme timbers themselves carry the local version of this. Suppressed growth in the years around 2070 and 2068 a recovery, then a rapid decline, and in the rings of the 2050, cellular features of the kind produced by severe winters or hard late frosts. A tree ring record from Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, shows irregular and reduced growth in a window that overlaps the same year, though that window carries a margin of several decades either side. The community that built these two monuments had been living through a run of bad years, and the wood they used is itself a record of those years. Across a wide range of European traditions, the cuckoo is the bird of summer, arriving in spring, falling silent around midsummer, and vanishing. Because nobody in pre-modern Europe knew where cuckoos went, the traditions filled the gap. The bird overwinters in a hole in a tree, or it goes to the other world. Alongside that sits a widespread and well-recorded body of folk story about penning the cuckoo, building a wall around the bird to keep it from leaving, on the logic that if the cuckoo cannot go, summer cannot end. The stories are usually told as jokes at the expense of some particular village, whose inhabitants built the wall one course too low. Nance proposes that Holme is a pen of exactly this kind, made in earnest. A wall of oak with a single narrow gap, a tree at the center for the bird, built in the season when the cuckoo sings, by people who badly needed the summer not to end. Holme, too, he reads as a companion, right of a much darker sort. An enclosure for a ritually killed consort of a goddess, a sacral king, killed on behalf of his people to end the cold, and he links the goddess to a wider family of ancient European and Asian figures identified with the planet Venus. The folklore Nance draws on was recorded in the medieval and modern periods. 2 millennia and more separate the stories from the structures, with no textual chain between them, and traditions of this kind are known to travel, mutate, and attach themselves to older objects after the fact. Climate evidence and cuckoo evidence are not of the same quality. Nance's argument depends on joining them. Nance's own paper is careful to quote the excavators against himself on one point. He notes an apparent correspondence between the axis through the forked entrance and the sunrise at midsummer, and then records the excavation, reports judgment that the circle's circumference is far too small for any accurate alignment to be taken from particular timbers. Neither reading can be tested at the site now. Holme is in a museum in King's Lynn, disassembled, conserved, and set out in an arrangement that is an interpretation in itself. Holme, too, was left where it stood, which is what the protesters of 1999 wanted for both of them. It is now gone. The sea took one of its 2 central logs in October 2003 and the other in March 2004, and the County Museum Service's description of the site today is that no archaeological remains can be seen there at all. Between them, the timbers have given up the year and the season they were cut, the direction each face was turned, the plant the rope was twisted from, the age of the trees and the weather of the decades before they came down. None of it says what the circle was for, or why the tree at its center had been dead a year before the posts around it were cut.